Well, hello, students. Today we're going to talk about some important women in U.S. history. Throughout the course of this class, we have talked about a lot of famous people. Many of them have been men. We have talked about a few women, and we're going to mention a couple of them today. But today I want to highlight a few important women in American history, and I want to highlight a few that maybe you haven't heard of before. There is a couple women that we'll talk about today that you have heard of before in this class, and I purposely left off a few of the most famous American women like Sacagawea and Harriet Tubman, because we've either already covered them and talked about them in quite a bit of detail, or we're going to talk about them later in the year in the case of Harriet Tubman. So let's begin with Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley was born in Senegal, where she was taken as a slave at the age of 8. In 1753, she was bought by a couple named John and Susanna Wheatley, who saw a lot of potential in young Phyllis, and so they educated her. They taught her how to read, they taught her how to write, and within 4 years, she published her first poem at the age of 12, just 12 years old. In 1773, she was the first United States slave or African American to publish a book in the U.S., which is a pretty amazing accomplishment. She ended up dying in 1783, which, if you do the math there, she was not that old, but she did die fairly young. 31 years old when she died. But Phyllis Wheatley was an incredible young woman because with these skills that she was given to read and write, she was able to become an established poet and writer, despite the fact that she was an African American and a slave. Second woman we want to talk about today is Anne Hutchinson. Now, we did talk about her a little bit earlier in the school year, but I do think it's worth highlighting again some of her accomplishments. Anne and her husband came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1600s, and pretty early on, Anne kind of took on what today we might classify as some feminist tendencies. She started to question the fact that the church and the leadership of the community there at the Massachusetts Bay Colony were just run by men, that no women had a say in the leadership process or the decision-making process. And so she began to start her own Bible study in her house, and at those Bible studies, she began to challenge some of the teachings of the Massachusetts church, and they didn't really like this too much. She developed a following. Many people began to come to her Bible study. Some of them came to her Bible study instead of going to church on Sundays. And so the leadership of the Massachusetts Bay Colony decided that Anne had to go. They could not have their authority challenged. At least that's the way they saw it. So in 1637, the Massachusetts governor, John Winthrop, put Hutchinson on trial for questioning male leadership of the church, and ultimately she was found guilty of that charge and banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Her and her husband and some of her followers moved to Rhode Island, where a colony that was more accepting of different religious beliefs, and Anne started kind of following there. Later on, Anne had moved to New York with her children. Her husband was not around anymore, and she moved to New York with her children, where 5 of her children and Anne were killed during a Mohawk Indian raid in 1643. But Anne Hutchinson is amazing, is an amazing woman, because at a time when women were told to be quiet and just do what their husbands say, Anne Hutchinson said she knew she had a gift of preaching, and she did not let that go to waste, and she challenged the male-dominated culture. So that's Anne Hutchinson. The next woman we want to talk about is someone who we also touched on earlier in the year, and that is Abby Adams. And Abigail Adams was the wife of President John Adams, our second president, and the mother of John Quincy Adams, our 6th president, who you just learned about recently. And she was an advisor to her husband. John Adams was a pretty smart guy, but he was smart enough to realize that his wife Abigail was actually smarter than he was. And so even though women were not valued in terms of their leadership at this time in society, John Adams knew that his wife had opinions that mattered. And so he would counsel with his wife. He would ask her questions about policy and about things going on when he was president, and even before he was president, when he was a delegate to the Continental Congress. And so when the Declaration of Independence was being written, John Adams was part of that committee, along with Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and two others. And John Adams was writing letters back and forth to his wife, Abby. John Adams was in Philadelphia. His wife was back in Boston at their home. And so he was writing letters back and forth. And in one of those letters, Abby said to John, "Remember the women when you write this Declaration of Independence. Don't forget about the women." Now, undoubtedly, John Adams took that into consideration. However, he did not ultimately make sure that there was something in the Declaration of Independence that gave women more rights. So that is Abigail Adams. And so let's move on to Pocahontas. Pocahontas, we've also learned a little bit about this year in class. She was the daughter of the Indian chief Powhatan at the first permanent English settlement in the Americas at Jamestown. We're not sure, but she may have saved John Smith's life. We don't know for sure. But what we do know 100% for sure is that Disney did not tell you the truth with the movie about Pocahontas, where they portrayed Pocahontas and John Smith in a romantic relationship. John Smith was probably about 38 to 40 at the time when he met Pocahontas, who was 11 or 12 years old when he met her. So clearly there was not a romantic relationship going on between the two of them, but Pocahontas would find romantic love with another one of the Jamestown colonists a little bit later. She did help the Jamestown colonists survive by bringing them food and telling them different pieces of information that were helpful for them to survive. And then ultimately she gets kidnapped by the English, and while she is being held as a captive by the English, she ends up marrying John Rolfe, and she converts to Christianity. She takes on an English name. She names herself Rebecca, and she actually has a child with John Rolfe, and they go to Europe. They move back to England together to basically try to convince people to come to Jamestown. She ends up dying in Europe, tragically at a young age, but Pocahontas was a pretty important figure in early colonist and American history. The next woman we want to talk about is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a slave who became an abolitionist in the build-up to the American Civil War. She also became what was called a suffragette, which is one of the women who were putting a lot of pressure on men to give women the right to vote in the United States. And during the Civil War, she recruited African-American troops to fight in the colored divisions for the North against the South. In 1865, she was one of the first peaceful protesters in terms of pointing out racism that was happening in America when she tried to ride on a white-only streetcar in Washington, D.C., and brought attention to this. So Sojourner Truth, pretty incredible lady, trying to get rid of slavery and also trying to achieve equal rights for women at the same time. The next one we want to talk about, we're going to get to women's rights. Like I just mentioned with Sojourner Truth, the next two women were really all about women's rights, especially the right to vote for women. So Susan B. Anthony was born a Quaker, and she became a teacher when she was an adult, but she would later become one of the leading suffragettes in the United States fighting for women's rights. In 1872, she illegally voted for the presidential election and was arrested. She was given a fine of $100 that she refused to pay. And then, so she was one of these leading women to try to realize women's rights, especially women's right to vote, which came in the early part of the 1900s. Well, in 1979, Susan B. Anthony was commemorated for her accomplishments, and she became the first woman to be on any United States currency, and she was put onto gold dollars. And the final woman we want to talk about is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Cady Stanton was the granddaughter of a Revolutionary War hero. She was a side-by-side partner with Susan B. Anthony, And maybe most importantly, in 1848, she published the Declaration of Women's Rights, where she basically said that married women should have the rights to own property and earn wages and many other fundamental rights that women were being denied at the time. In 1848, at Seneca Falls in New York, there was a convention of women, and Stanton, along with another woman named Lucretia Mott, organized it. And it was the first public women's rights meeting ever in United States history, and it's kind of forever remembered for that. After the convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton ultimately made a huge sacrifice, because after the convention, her husband left town and left her, and her father examined her for mental illness because he thought she was way out of line with what she had done at the Seneca Falls Convention. And so these women that we talked about today are just a few of important women in United States history. There are many, many more. And what I'd like you to do is check out the assignment for this week, which is going to have you choose a woman, an influential woman in American history, modern day. A woman that is alive today and has been an influential person in American history. So check out the details of the assignment. And if you have any questions, email me or Schoology message me.